A lot of my viewers have asked me if I could make a video commenting on the most recent controversy to erupt from our unending culture war. And this latest controversy is none other than that surrounding a group of high school students from Covington Catholic and their encounter with one Native American activist they had after their participation in the March for Life, which also happened to coincide with an Indigenous rights march that was going on the same day. Now, this controversy erupted over the weekend during a time that I didn't really have access to a microphone and a window to make a video. And while I did comment on it via Twitter, by the time the dust settled, and both the progressive outrage mob had their say, and subsequently there was a reaction to that outrage, I found myself at a loss at what original idea I could really add to the entire situation. It seems people feel that this is yet another turning point, but people have a hard time putting their finger on why or how. And I think I can start there with my own commentary on the incident. However, I'm going to back up and just give a little bit of a rehash of what happened this weekend for those people who've been living under a rock during this particular news cycle. So, as it stands, after a week of rather embarrassing stories coming out of the press, at least for the progressive side, largely concerning the negotiations over the government shutdown and BuzzFeed, Washington was once more taken by storm over protests during the March for Life, an annual protest held on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, which, while massive in size, year after year gets very little attention from the mainstream press, despite the fact that its numbers would dwarf any women's march that typically gets a lot more media attention. At any rate, the March for Life is typically a hub for young activists coming out of Catholic and Christian backgrounds. Catholic schools and colleges oftentimes organize trips to bring their students in to participate in the march, since support for the life of the unborn is a core mission of the church itself. And usually the protest stays very, very narrowly focused on the abortion and life issue. Of course, politics tends to skew a little bit more right-wing, although it is not uncommon to see placards saying Democrats for Life or the occasional Make America Great Again hat. I think it was the generally raised political temperatures in Washington, however, that this year kicked off some really bizarre confrontations over groups that really quite regularly appear in Washington every January. And the most prominent one, of course, was a group of students from Covington High who ran into a series of activists in front of the Lincoln Memorial, starting with a group of Black Israelites, which are sort of like a Westboro Baptist church on the left, who assailed the boys, who were mostly white, with racial slurs and generally crude insults directed at them. And this was quickly followed in succession by another confrontation with a Native American activist by the name of Nathan Phillips, who, with a group of friends, approached the high schoolers banging a drum and singing an Indian spiritual song, while the high schoolers stood by staring, singing school spirit songs, and generally making light of the situation they were in. The most circulated image to come out of the interaction was one in which a Covington High student stared on, smiling, as Phillips banged his drum and sang his song an inch away from the teenager's face. Now, this image, completely out of context, was circulated around Saturday and Sunday to a torrent of outrage from every section of verified blue checkmark Twitter. Almost every mainstream newspaper, along with media site from Slate to the Huffington Post, published pieces about how the Covington teens surrounded the Native American activist and mocked him, leaving out, of course, the original context that was readily available even when the original story broke. By the time a few hours had passed, the usual suspects, from Jessica Valenti to Amanda Marcotte to our friend at Right Wing Watch, Jared Holt, had called out this interaction to be the high point of racism and bigotry betrayed by the students, and called again for consequences, suspension, expulsion, any means of censoring the students and the teachers that had brought them to the pro-life rally to begin with. But oddly enough, the outrage tsunami didn't stop stop there. Other mainstream figures like Reza Aslan and Kathy Griffin started taking it one step further, talking about how the teenagers, again minors, had punchable faces, how they should be doxxed, and how their lives should be destroyed for participating in this interaction where they allegedly condescended to a Native American activist. Once more, the picture of the Covington High student smiling in the face of the Native American as he played the drum was the spearhead of this outrage mob. The picture that captured the racism and bigotry of America in one scene. This was the privileged white male who was laughing in the face of a poor, downtrodden Native American activist who was also a Vietnam War vet. This was the height of disrespect from Catholic and Christian young men, something that was directly in opposition to everything that Catholicism and Christianity taught, even elements of the right-wing web. The National Review, Ben Shapiro, and a number of other right-leaning bloggers like Rod Dreher jumped on this bandwagon before they even knew what they had. The archdiocese in charge of Covington even wrote a letter condemning the students for their behavior, without looking at any additional facts. And, of course, what happened? Well, after 2 days, and after looking at the surrounding videos, which clearly show that the teenage group from Covington High were passively standing, waiting for a bus when approached by the activists, first the Black Israelites and then Phillips himself, the picture of the teens' reaction to those accosting them is now seen in a distinctly different light, at least by those on the center and to the right of center. For the most part, the left has doubled down. And of course, if you go on any right-wing or center-right YouTube channel, if you've watched any videos in the last 2 days, you've probably heard all about this story. But at least for people on the right, this particular instance feels completely different. Again, it feels like we're at some kind of turning point, that this is an indication of a much larger failure, and that we've only begun to scratch the surface of what happened here. I think the reason for this really begins with the kind of reaction that the first video clip got shortly after it was released this weekend. The video clip itself was actually not even very objectionable. It's essentially Phillips playing his drum while students around him, admittedly wearing MAGA hats, sing, and one student at the center simply smiles and stares on. A little uncomfortable to be sure, but no atrocity. And given that the subjects were minors, something that seems more or less forgivable. Of course, that's not what happened. Within 5 hours, every verified checkmark was fanning the flames of an outrage mob that was demanding punishment, and for the most part, the expulsion of these students. Here again, we're talking about 16 or 17-year-old boys. They can't drink, they can't vote, some of them can't even have a driver's license yet. Yet one uncomfortable interaction with a seasoned activist, 50 years their elder, and immediately every element of the mainstream media is calling for their heads. But more than just that, the problem lay with the fact the conservatives, those who are on the right side of the culture war, the people who should know better about how the left-wing outrage mob works, lay down and cooperated with the online mob with virtually no evidence of any kind of malfeasant act on the part of the students in question. All they had was a video showing at most disrespect on the part of the students towards an activist. And that was enough to get the National Review and the Daily Wire on board with a lynch mob. The same mob that felt very, very comfortable threatening even the safety of these minors. And threats coming from verified blue check-marked Twitter accounts. People we are told by the mainstream that we should be respecting. The very organizations of the diocese, the organization that put these minors in an activist position to begin with, throwing their wards under the bus the second the outrage mob reared its head. Do people not know how this works? Do people not know that we're in a culture war? Is this 2012 or is it 2019? How could this happen? I think what the right wing is feeling in the wake of the Covington Catholic controversy is really disappointed outrage. we realize that the leaders that we have currently at the head of the Republican Party, at the heads of our churches, the people who speak for us in our media organizations really have no clue what's going on. Either that or their incentives are totally misaligned to the current reality of political discourse in America in the 21st century. Of course, at this point, it looks like the Covington high school students are going to be all right. Enough footage has been leaked, enough information has been revealed, enough lies of the activists have been exposed to make their defense not a problem now that the dust has settled. But for a moment, let's just speculate on what would have happened had we not had extended video footage from the event before and after. Or if, as in pre-2015, the blue check marks, the verified mainstream media, was the only prevailing voice in creating the narrative around this particular event. What would have happened in that case? Well, I can tell you what would have happened. These teenagers, these minors, these children would have been expelled, their families would have been humiliated, and their future prospects would have been totally destroyed. And all the while, the very institutions that supposedly supported them, those that asked for their activist help to participate in the March for Life, would have cooperated with the establishment to carry out these punishments against the very people to whom they owed a primary responsibility to protect. Even if additional facts had emerged after the initial media outrage that exonerated these students, little would have been done by the mainstream. Even now we see a total unwillingness by progressive Twitter and by the mainstream media outlets to retract and apologize for their mischaracterization of this interaction. And if the mainstream media had kept up their narrative, it would be really almost impossible for these institutions that safeguarded the students' future not to follow suit. Basically, these young men's reputation was saved by pure circumstance. And no one thinks that this is going to be the last of these incidents. There will be more. Phillips himself, the Native American activist involved on the other side of this confrontation, seems to be almost a professional at generating these types of controversies. And will the progressive media learn its lesson? Well, not likely. Despite what might get you banned from social media if you're Sargon of Akkad or Milo Yiannopoulos, no one is going to lose their blue check mark over possibly destroying the lives of high school students or calling for violence against them. And those on the right have to live with the fact that their political organizations essentially played ball with this effort, made no real attempt to stop it, at least when it was in full swing. When the lynch mob had full power, they simply caved, without even looking at all of the evidence which was readily available from day one. And of course, the eternal question reasserts itself. Why? Why did moderate progressives seek the heads of high school students whose crime was being irreverent? And why did the right side of the spectrum fail what may be the biggest shit test of 2019? How can we explain this failure? And I think the explanation comes by examining, of all things, the mind of the moderate, liberal, white person. Now, those of you who watch this channel know that I don't usually like the term white to describe a European or a North American of European extraction. But I think in this particular instance, it is entirely warranted. The moderate white liberal is the quintessential white person. These liberals may be on the right, they may be on the left, but nevertheless, they have an unshakable faith that there is some kind of natural justice that will ultimately prevail in American politics. That there is a mainstream sensibility that they are in tune with, such that radical deviations to the left or the right will ultimately correct themselves, simply through the process of national discussion and the process of American history. Oftentimes we describe this perspective as being boomer on the radical right. I know that the alt-right classically called these people cuckservatives, although people in this position are just as likely to be leaning to the left as they are to be leaning to the right. But at any rate, left or right, these individuals are loyal to an idea of America, and it is almost always an idea of a white America that they either remember from a previous era or are nostalgic for, even if they have never experienced it. And of course, there are counterparts in the European example as well. A very common feature of this group is that they, after everything they've seen in contemporary American politics, both before and after 2016, believe that they represent the power of the political center, that essentially at the end of the day what they think is common sense will reign, even if there are slight interruptions and deviations. This creates sort of a strange Pollyannaism, but makes them seem almost like farcical characters when they're looked at by people who are trying to grapple with the reality of very, very drastic social change, as seen by people both on the radical right and on the radical left. Now, these white moderate liberals, again, both center-left and center-right, oftentimes are regarded as innocuous fence-sitters, political dark matter, and largely inconsequential to how things happen on Twitter or how things manifest in the wars between the left and the right when they rage on platforms like Twitter. But I think that if you look at this Covington Catholic controversy, you will see that on both sides, in both the initial progressive overreaction and also the conservative collapse, that the problem originates from the same group of moderate white liberals, the same people who might describe themselves as non-combatants in the battle over what it means to be a citizen of the West in the 21st century. Let's start with the moderate left wing, the corporate media blue check marks that kicked off this controversy. Now, it might surprise some on the right to learn that really these kind of culture war disturbances, these kind of outrages at the treatment of minorities at the hands of high school students really isn't driven by communist or Antifa types. It's driven by a certain kind of mainstream journalist. Of course, some of these journalists are radicals, as in the case of Amanda Marcotte and Jessica Valenti. These are people who obviously have some kind of deep psychological hang-up, especially when it comes to young, straight white men, to the point where when they see one smirking, they psychologically feel like they have to destroy that person. But if it was just these radicals, these kind of outrages wouldn't get off the ground. What really kicks these witch hunts off is a certain class of moderate left-wing, and yes, I will say white, journalist and media personality, still enthralled by a certain narrative about how justice in America is supposed to unfold in the 21st century. This type of activist obviously got involved in journalism, largely told romantic tales about the civil rights era, and about the great accomplishments in justice accomplished by progressives and those on the moderate left in decades prior. And they're hungry to see a similar narrative play out, for opportunities to open up for all Americans, simply by reforming away the gross issues of bigotry and racism existing in largely white spaces within the American power structure. They long to be heroes in contrast with a villain that everybody, at least on the right-thinking side, agrees is bad and needs to be cast down. Now, the problem is that this narrative, at least in its plain form, simply does not hold up in 21st century America. The large instances of gross legal bigotry and corporate racism, at least of the explicit kind, has been stamped out in the late 80s and early 90s. The corporate leaders of modern America are more than willing to play any kind of diversity game that activists or journalists throw down for them. Moreover, Middle America, long the target of civil rights activism for its apathy and complacency in the face of a status quo that progressives at least considered unjust, no longer displays outward signs of bigotry that make easy targets for journalistic articles or for activist outrage. Moreover, Middle America's share of the overall economic pie and political power in America has distinctly waned in present years. It's the classic case of diminishing returns. The progressive activist class doesn't have enough villains for its hard left audience, but it also does not have a large enough audience, at least in terms of its moralized preaching. The last hurrah of this seems to have been in Obama's first term. As such, the moderate left at this stage is left with too few battles to fight and underwhelming economic results to show. If removing the bigotry of Middle America was supposed to make everything better, why hasn't the promised improvements manifested in the lives of minorities? The bigotry has to exist somewhere, and this, of course, creates the drive to find, as Tom Wolfe put it, the great white defendant, the witch that can explain away why all the problems in the modern American village have been taking place. And so it goes, a class of moderate progressives in journalistic positions that will nonetheless jump at any possibility to vindicate their own narrative on why America has the issues that it does. Alright, so that more or less covers the moderate liberal white in the left-leaning sphere, but how does this manifest in the right-leaning sphere on the internet? Those moderate right-wingers of the National Review, bloggers like Rod Dreher, and everyone who jumped on the bandwagon of those calling for blood against the Covington kids in spite of the fact that the organizations were explicitly pro-life, and therefore on the right in the culture war. At once, this might be harder to see. Of course, the right is the opponent of political correctness. They do not think that there is necessarily bigotry underneath every stone, and they are just as likely to want to point to things like personal responsibility as to why the manifested promises of the civil rights era have not come to pass in the modern era. And for this reason, I think their betrayal in this particular instance is a little bit hard to explain, but not if you think a little bit harder about it. The moderate conservative side of the culture war isn't necessarily invested in a narrative of nascent bigotry, but it is reliant on an understanding of America that is whole. They are reliant on a narrative of America that has a center-right soul that, implicitly, the conservative speaks for. They too, just like their left-wing counterpart, are invested in the idea that moderate white America, or middle America, has much more power than it does in the beginning of the 21st century. Again, it is not 1965 here. There have been shifts in capital, shifts in money, shifts in political power. Yet the moderate conservative wants to imagine that none of this has occurred, that he is in essence the voice of a moderate, post-civil rights majority that has only but to wake up and re-establish some second coming of Ronald Reagan for America to be put back on the right track. In essence, just as the moderate left-wing journalist longs to be the civil rights champion making the complaint about middle America in 1965, the conservative longs to be, and LARPs as, the establishment, the authority, the mainstream that the civil rights activist complains to. The moderate conservative longs to be the representative of standards, of normalcy, and of common sense in a mainstream that no longer functionally exists in America or in the West today. Strangely enough, he is invested in the narrative that his movement has more power and has had more successes, in the same way that his left counterpart is invested in the narrative that their movement has had fewer successes and possesses less power. Because the left-wing audience is fundamentally activist-focused. They are always anti-establishmentarian, and therefore representatives of the moderate left constantly have to be showing that they are not part of the establishment, counter-signaling the hypothetical mainstream, even if that mainstream no longer functionally exists. Similarly, conservatives are status quo-oriented. They are anti-activist in nature, and therefore the moderate conservative has an incentive to perpetuate the exact same myth in the opposite direction, pretending to be the victor and the representative of the mainstream in order to convince his audience that things really aren't so bad, that things will return to normalcy soon without any additional effort. Thus, the conservative moderate can in some ways be tricked into playing along with progressive mob mentality. As a conservative, they are, of course, the guardians of well-to-do behavior, of common sense, of how things used to be done when America was a much more homogenous society and a much higher trust society, when identity politics didn't play such a large role and require the same kind of cultural precautions and cultural insulation. All that the progressive advocates and journalists have to do is voice their objection in slightly conservative terms. These teenagers are disrespecting a veteran. These Christian and Catholic high schoolers aren't turning the cheek. These young men are acting in a manner that is unbecoming of a true gentleman. These white people are participating in rank bigotry against an oppressed minority. All of these narratives hold and sound good, even conservative, in the context of 1965. Bigotry is bad. Unpoliteness is bad. And we should always aspire to turn the other cheek. And so, you hear moderates, especially moderate Catholics, spin narratives, saying something along the lines of, well, in my day, if young men acted so disrespectfully towards elders, the nuns at my Catholic school would have rapped them on the wrist. Leaving aside, of course, a certain rose-tinted view of how young men behaved, even in the 50s and 60s. Believe me, teenagers were still rowdy back then. This sort of manners-first perspective completely misses the cultural changes that have taken place in America in the last 40 years. I'm sure Catholic school kids would have been more polite to elders in 1965, but they probably wouldn't have had to sit there as their elders told them to go back to Europe and pelted them with anti-Catholic and racist epitaphs before further contriving a confrontation with the group designed to call out their whiteness and hate. If moderates nostalgic for a previous generation of America think that this is anything like what would have pertained in the national conversation 50 years ago, they really are misremembering, or simply latching on to a narrative of an era that they never lived through. And we see how, on both the left and the right, these moderate liberal white people were driving the entire controversy. And the main psychological motivation is the same. They want the illusion that they still have power. The moderate liberal center, especially the moderate liberal white center, is dependent on, and is in turn addicted to, the notion that they speak for the majority of Americans. That there is a white America that they can successfully preach to and convert. Either preach to and convert from a left-wing perspective, or preach and convert from a right-wing perspective. Nevertheless, what both of these groups are confronting is the fact that the mainstream that they used to represent no longer significantly exists. Nevertheless, they will masquerade that this is not the case, that white middle America is indefinitely the base of American political hegemony, if for no other reason than to shore up their own egos and also their own careers. In the conservative case, this is even more farcical because this pantomime of power is costing their coalition in terms of narrative and in terms of positioning, all the while they support the idea that they speak for the mainstream. They are marching around acting as chief petty officers for a moral system that no longer has full sway over the American public, and largely at the expense of their own side of the political spectrum, at the expense of any new right-wing movement that might emerge from things as they currently stand. Now, of course, most of the moderate righties realize their mistake in Covington and have retracted. Some have even, very honorably, apologized for their mistakes. But this doesn't even begin to get to the heart of the problem, especially for the right wing in this country. Because there is one big way in which the two sides of the moderate liberal are distinctly not symmetrical between left and right. The left can play this game indefinitely. The left is on the right side of a dying middle America. They can continue on their own journalism schools, their own colleges for activism, slowly replacing moderate liberals with more activist, more radically oriented people of color, until their own movement consists largely of an activist center with an elite moderate core designed to maintain the institutions of power and keep the door open to mainstream pivots. This is a long-term demographic strategy that is, if nothing else, one that could possibly win. However, no such similar strategy exists for the moderate right. They cannot simultaneously pretend to be owners over the mainstream, take responsibility for being America's moral conscience, and advocate for standards when they have no ability to enforce those standards in the middle of a mainstream that no longer plays by middle America's rules. If they play this game, they are going to end up with all of the liability and none of the power, which is exactly where progressives want them to be. Moreover, their presence as a token opposition will fuel the left-wing coalition and keep it together long enough for a progressive victory to prevail in the culture war. What's needed now more than anything else is activism, to understand the conservative movement as lobbyists for a particular branch of North Americans. It can pursue justice, it can even advocate for social justice and lay out internal standards for those who are inside of it. But at the end of the day, the right has to advocate and be activists for the groups that comprise it. It has to defend its own constituencies, and it has to understand the defense of those constituencies as something that is one in the same cause as that of justice, social justice, and charity. The boundary between those concepts and politics have now been completely abolished by the culture war. And if there is not a reaction by the right through which we understand that solidarity, collective lobbying, and activism is at the center of our cause, we will inevitably be destroyed trying to appeal to a center that no longer holds the majority of power. I'm reminded as I close this take with a conversation that I had with the Britisher on Academic Agent's livestream. Here, the Britisher echoed a very, very common mainstream or moderate conservative talking point that if these outrageous incidences persisted, then he, as a moderate and a representative of, in his case, the moderate side of the British consciousness, would be inevitably and irrevocably turned against the left wing. And he made this remark as if it was a warning that needed to be heeded by the left, and that if it wasn't heeded by the left, would spell their ultimate political doom. But of course, this is the same moderate liberal perspective that drove the very problem that we saw at the Lincoln Memorial this weekend. The left wing does not need to worry about appealing to middle America or the mainstream of British opinion, because these two groups have less and less power as demographics shift and the dispensation and political orientation of the West changes. There is not going to be a pendulum swing. Activism and not implicit cultural norms, nor Western tradition, controls the location of the political Overton window. And if the right, and indeed all those who oppose the radical end of the progressive movement, cannot figure out how to do proper group activism, they will be devoured by the forces of history in short order. Thank you very much for listening, and have a wonderful rest of the evening.